Hi everyone. Today we're going to be talking about sort of the world from 5,000 years ago to today. And the underlying question here is, are we so different from our ancestors? Actually, you know what? I don't even know why I really put that question there. I just wanted a cool subtitle. That's actually not really a good description of what we're going to be talking about in this lecture, but so just ignore the subtitle. The outline for today, though, is we're going to understand how some huge changes in the past 5,000 years have affected our experience of being human, namely the rise of agriculture, the rise of civilization, and ongoing diversity. So we're going to talk about 5 things, okay? First thing, and I've got this cool little graphic to show you. Food transitions, because 5,000 years ago, food changed again, and it changed everything else. If there's one thing you're getting from this class, it's that food matters. Number 2, the rise of, quote, civilizations, and we'll talk about what we mean by that term. Number 3, we're going to talk about the collapse of civilizations, and I have the word yikes written there, because that's serious business. And then the 4th point we're going to be talking about is some of the archaeological history of Native America, Native North America, because I think that's particularly pertinent since that's where we live. And then point number 5, we're going to kind of conclude this whole unit that we've been talking about human origins. So first, let's talk about food transitions. And I want you to think not just about food transitions, but transitions in human life overall. So the picture on the left is a representation of a prehistoric foraging band. The picture on the right is some dude reading a book. I don't know what book. Maybe it's Twilight. Let's say it's Twilight. In the middle of a city. He is surrounded by thousands of people, most of whom don't know his name. I mean, unless he's really famous or something. Maybe this is some celebrity. I don't know celebrities very well, so maybe he is. But presumably he's surrounded by thousands of people who don't know his name. He goes to a store and procures food wrapped in cellophane and plastic from people that he doesn't know, which was shipped hundreds of miles from farmers that from food processing plants, which received it from farmers who he, again, doesn't know. Typically, these farms would have mass-produced this food in really, really large farms or really, really large concentrated animal feedlots. He wears clothes that were made by machines that were created by people he doesn't know, using technology he doesn't understand. He goes and does a job doing, let's say, social media consulting, where he types away at a computer that he didn't build and that he doesn't really understand. And he owes thousands of dollars in debt to credit card companies, which controls a large amount of his emotional energy, even though it's, in some sense, sort of just numbers on a page, or rather, not even numbers on a page anymore, just numbers on his computer that he doesn't understand. His life, in so many ways, could not be more different from the way human life was during foraging time period, where you would have lived in a small band. That band would have had, let's say, 50 people. Many of those people would have been your extended family as well as friends. There may have been some leaders. Those leaders probably didn't have a whole lot of control over the group, and if you didn't like those leaders, you could kind of just say, hey, talk to you later, I'm going off to another band. You would have been actively involved in the hunting. You killed the animals, you gathered the food. Everything about these two circumstances could not be more different from each other, and yet they're both human beings, right? This is sort of what we sometimes consider the human default, since as far as we can tell from the fossil record, this is what hominins were doing for hundreds of thousands of years prior to the Neolithic Revolution. But then this is rapidly becoming the default, right? Every trend that we can measure says that more and more humans are moving to cities and to towns and leaving sort of rural areas, that humans are less and less directly connected to their food sources, and that although that's more accelerated in industrialized areas like the United States, that's also true of many parts of the quote-unquote developing world or global south as well. So we're rapidly changing, right? We've rapidly changed over the last 10,000 years, and somehow more and more human lives are starting to look like this, rather than anything even remotely resembling this. So how did that happen? That's what we're talking about today. And it's not just about how did this happen in the past tense, but how is it still happening in the present? This sort of city-based, huge-scale civilizations are overtaking and sort of absorbing in, sometimes by choice, sometimes by force, other types of societies, smaller-scale types of societies, such as, for example, in Eastern Africa, Maasai pastoralists, who traditionally until relatively recently, were organized as tribes of people with village elders, a few thousand people, who had village elders who sort of decided who was going to run their cattle in different lands and were largely living off these cattle. And that's still the case to a large degree among Maasai people. And yet Maasai people now find themselves absorbed into larger nations, governments that feel like they can tax the Maasai or impose laws on the Maasai or say where the Maasai are supposed to run their cattle and where they're not. So in a sense, not just foraging groups, but also pastoral groups, horticultural groups over time, over the past 5,000 years and still to this day, are getting absorbed and wrapped into nation states, getting absorbed and drawn into cities. Life is rapidly changing, so how did we get from there to here, and how are things changing? And as I talk about that, we're sort of, in a sense, talking about what we sometimes call cultural evolution, and I want to clarify what I mean by that. Cultural evolution is a little bit like biological evolution in the sense that just because something is evolving doesn't mean it's progressing to something better. Indeed, the point of evolution is not better or worse so much as just continuing, right? So dinosaurs, according to scientists, evolved into birds, but a T-Rex is rather more impressive than a chicken, at least if you were to ask my 5-year-old. He's obsessed with T-Rexes and doesn't seem overly concerned about chickens. And so evolution does not necessarily mean progress. And so as we talk about societies, the general trend of foraging societies being displaced by the rise of, quote, civilizations, these huge societies, it's not to imply that life is better in huge societies. Instead, we would probably have to frankly acknowledge that there have been both positive and negative trends over the past 5,000 years, and also that it's sort of a matter of what you consider to be important in human life. If we're talking, for example, about human freedom, the capacity of an individual to sort of do what they want, I think you could argue pretty reasonably that hunter-gatherer bands had greater individual freedom in the sense that there was no written laws and no really formal legal system or police system. On the other hand, there was far less cultural and religious and social diversity within these groups, far more of an expectation to adhere to certain cultural norms, so maybe that means there was less freedom. There was obviously not modern medicine, and so rates of infant mortality in groups 6,000 years ago were very high. On the other hand, the modern industrialized West has its own suite of health problems, which, such as diabetes, cardiac issues, a number of things that, although they're not non-existent in earlier societies, certainly seem to have been less prevalent. And so evolution does not necessarily mean progress, but it does mean change. So let's talk about change.